let's go on, because Lynn gets in touch to ask about the by-election that's coming up, Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse. And actually it builds on what we were just saying about Reform UK capitalising on these sorts of messages in Scotland. So Lynn says, I would welcome all of your thoughts on the amount of weight the SNP are putting behind this by-election, with all the big names and heavy hitters posting regularly on social media that they are out canvassing the doors to win a seat they currently hold. This will be Katie Loudon's third attempt to win a seat, having previously lost out in Rutherglen. So Lynn gets in touch on Saturday. She says, today it's reported that even MSP Nicola Sturgeon, brackets part-time in my opinion, will be taking time away from her book promotion tour and making an appearance. We've already seen campaign photos posted with the majority of the cabinet and other ministers. Is this desperation? If so, why? Asks Lynn. And I wonder, Jeff, will we start with you on this? Is it desperation? Is it the fact that this is a huge electoral talking point? It's potentially the only kind of electoral test that of this kind of scale that will happen before 2026 now. You know, maybe there'll be other by-elections between now and then. It's the only one we know of. And so it's about throwing the kitchen sink at it because it's going to dictate the story from here on out.
Yeah, look, let's give John Swinney and Kate Forbes a pass on the general election. I mean, they'd hardly got their feet under the table before the election was called. So I view this as a massive test. You know, there's been better news for the SNP and local by-elections of late, but this is a parliamentary seat at a time we're about to enter a parliamentary election in Scotland. So, of course, the SNP are throwing everything at it. I think every party will be throwing everything at it because it will be viewed as a bit of a barometer to what might transpire in, 13, 14 months or so. So, look, no, God, less than that,
Less
12
than that.
months.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness,
It's
12
like
months.
10 months,
Yeah,
really.
yes, indeed. So yeah, look, I can see why you'd throw the kitchen sink. Of course you would, politically. Now, I've got a bit of intelligence just from speaking to some people who've been out campaigning in different parties. One in the SNP, one in Labour, and one in the Tories. They all say the same thing, that folk are scunnered, they're fed up, and I think turnout's going to be low. And if turnout is low on the day, look for reform. And I don't think, amazing as it is to say it, that second place is a ridiculous notion. I would still put perhaps Labour as favourites for second place. Can you believe we're even saying that a year after they've won a landslide election at Westminster? But look out for reform here, and what a seismic shock that would be if they managed to sneak into second place. But last thing I just very quickly say is, it doesn't almost matter how reform do. We know they're going to do reasonably well because they've coming from such a low base. And so that will be a big story emanating from the evening anyway, I'm sure. But if they do get second place, bloody hell, I mean, that's a big story.
There's a couple of people I've spoken to as well who have both independently said the same thing, that on weekend days when obviously the campaigners are out in force and there's stalls up on the high streets and whatever, that people are gathering around the Reform UK sort of area and having a big chat and a nice friendly time, and down the road is the Scottish Labour one, which is not seeing much activity at all. Now, I'm happy to hear from campaigners from all sides on your own take on the inside, the inside track and what's going on. One of those people definitely has a stake in this thing. One of the people who told me that absolutely does not. They are looking at it completely objectively and saying there is enthusiasm for Reform UK. Andy, what are you making of the by-election? And Lynn's thoughts here is they're throwing a lot at it. They've got Nicola Sturgeon out on the campaign trail. I'd put alongside that reports from Paul Hutchin, who says, I understand Scottish Labour have still not agreed to put their Hamilton candidate David Russell up for an STV candidates debate on June the 2nd. Party insiders fear Russell will do badly on TV, as in David Russell. An extraordinary situation. The debate could now be Reform versus SNP with no Labour, says the Daily Record political editor.
Yeah, well, let's see. I think there are two interesting things in particular about this by-election. I think the first one is that the SNP are now at the fag end of their fourth term of office.
Astonishing.
And the record in government, if an impartial person would say that the record in government is patchy. Let's call it patchy. I think that's a reasonable word to use.
Not the first two governments, I didn't think. I thought they were very, very good.
They were a solid couple of years.
Anywhere else in the democratic world, a government with a patchy record at the end of its fourth term would not win a by-election. I mean, they wouldn't even, as it would be ridiculous to even think they could possibly win a by-election, right? So I think that is notable in itself. People from abroad would look at this and say, that's odd. What's going on in that country? I think the second interesting thing, though, is obviously to do with reform. I mean, it'll be I still think there's a lot of water to flow under the bridge when it comes to reform and their performance in May 2026. There's a long way to go. With a party like Reform, which has grown so quickly, there's a lot that can go wrong, principally to do with the sort of people that are attaching themselves to it. And I don't think we know enough yet to know where that's going to end up in 12 months' time. They could do well. They could get 15, 16 seats. They also could get 4. Right? I think there's a long way to go in that yet. But what is interesting will, I think, be the shift in voting patterns between the Tories and Labour and which of them goes to Reform. Because as far as I can see at the moment, the Keir Starmer and Kevin Badenoch strategy is basically the same, which is Nigel Farage is bang on right, so don't vote for him.
Very good.
Expand on that a bit more for us.
That's what they're saying. They're saying, oh yes, of course he's right about immigration, so that's why we're moving and we're doing this and this and this. And of course,
but Andy, the critical point, they're not explicitly saying he's right. They're just dealing with the issues
as they say. To him.
So he's dictating discourse in this country.
And in the window on all the debates that Nigel Farage wants to lead, the window is moving towards Farage in all these debates. Okay?
Yeah.
And they're expecting that the population will say, they're going to do it this time. I know they've said they've been going to do it for the last 25 years and they haven't, but they're going to do it this time. So actually, I was going to vote for Farage, but I think I'm just going to go back and vote for them now because they said they've made a mistake and now they know. I mean, come on, this is not the world. So I think that sort of pattern will be interesting actually to see just how many votes shift from the Tories and Labour over to Reform and just how well they do. So I mean, you know my views on by-elections, guys, right? My views on by-elections.
There's been some flip-flopping, I think.
I think they're interesting in the moment, but I think they often don't have a bearing on the big election that follows. And I think this will be the same, but that's not to say it won't reveal some really interesting movements and patterns when we see it in a couple of weeks' time.
Okay, I'll be nice and I'll be a bit nasty, right? You're right in terms of Farage dictating kind of discourse just now in terms of the response, the knee-jerk response from Badenoch and Starmer. But you're also right, actually, to be fair, to say, look, we still need to see the bones of what this Reform Party looks like in a Scottish context. We don't know, but you play the ball where it lies. They're in the aftermath of such a massive victory. There's a bit of a glow about them. They don't have a record to defend, and so I do anticipate them doing reasonably well in the by-election. But the reason that this is important is for the reason you've just set out, Andy, is because if they do well and get to second place or close to it, that dictates how Anna Sarwar and Russell Finlay have to respond, because and so the same thing that's happening in England will happen in Scotland as far as those parties are concerned. Now, the one outlier is how the SNP respond. And I would just have a word of caution for John Swinney in this. He seems to be wanting to raise the prospects of reform by calling them out, just not inviting them to my big summit on how we can all be nice to each other and all the rest of it. By doing that, he does run the risk of raising the prospect of greater success for reform as well. There is a balance to be struck there. You've got to be careful. Look at that local by-election result in Clydebank. If I'm not mistaken, I was just trying to look it up on my phone, but I couldn't find it in time. I think they were only 6-7% behind the SNP reform. Yeah. I mean, that's starting to get squeaky bum time, to quote the world's greatest manager, Alex Ferguson. I mean, look, that is, you're getting into, okay, we've had our fun with them. They're splitting the unionist vote, but let's make sure they don't overtake us as well. And so there has to be a little bit more thought given to how the SNP approach this as well, not just Labour and Tories.
That's an interesting thing. I don't know what you think about this then, Jeff, because I think there's a real juxtaposition here between ideas. Because on the one hand, Swinney must be thinking, the better Farage does, the better the prospects of him being Prime Minister. Does independence get a better enemy than that? Or a bigger friend than that, sorry, I should say, from the independence point of view. Do we get a better chance to really accelerate the case for independence than Nigel Farage being in a position of power? So I get that. But on the other hand, now he hasn't done this too much just yet, but he has been in danger. I think it's when he has flirted with suggesting that people who vote for reform are wrong-uns. And I do think that he has to be very careful with that. Because what you do not want to do in your own country is call a relatively large subsection of the population wrong-uns because of who they're voting for. So there is that. It's a real double-edged sword, I think, for him in that respect. I think you're right. What if they do get 25% or whatever in this by-election? You then I think people are then compelled to ask John, well, what do you think of those? Not what do you think of Nigel Farage? What do you think of the 25%
people that voted?
People
yeah,
who voted
absolutely.
For
That's your own folk. That's exactly.
So
that's the risk.
Risky.
That is the risk. Yeah, that is the risk.
Yeah.
That's why I think this by-election is utterly fascinating, and the timing of it. It's just so relevant to what might come afterwards. Having it a year out from the Holyrood elections is so insightful.
Just on timing as well. So I'm just thinking of the issues that have absolutely plagued Labour since they came to power. And perhaps foremost among them is winter fuel payment allowance. And this was a huge part of the English local election drubbing that they got. And yet there's kind of floating in the air, we've been talking about it on the radio a bit, floating in the air is this idea that winter fuel payment, there may be a U-turn on the way, but it's nothing concrete yet on that.
Yeah, look, great point. I couldn't believe it yesterday. I was looking at a story in the BBC, and it said that options are under discussion to changing eligibility. Essentially, ministers at the UK level are considering easing the winter fuel payment cuts. But according to this news item, that decision could be announced on the 11th of June. Now, what bloody use is that to Scottish Labour? Because the election is on the 5th of June. So the SNP, who have been campaigning on this already, saying they took it away, we reinstored it, easy, simple messaging. I think Paul Hutchin, actually, who you mentioned earlier, pointed that out on social media. He's absolutely right to do so. And yet the Labour Party can't campaign on the fact that they listened and they tried to ease it, because by that point, the decision won't have been taken. This is where we get to the lack of dialogue and strategy between UK and Scottish Labour parties. And they need to get their act together, because if they could absolve that now, then, they'd have a much better run into the election, something to get, stick your teeth into, hook on, but they're not. And the SNP can dine out on that until election day, knowing that the decision won't be made until a week later. Just nonsensical, in my opinion. Really poor strategy.
It's also fascinating because I personally was quite taken by Shanks last week saying that the relationship between himself and the Scottish government was pretty decent. He's not going a week without speaking to Kate Forbes or Gillian Martin. That's all well and good. We like that. That's good. Constructive working together. It seems the relationship between UK Labour and Scottish Labour is actually not in as good shape as the relationship between UK Labour and the SNP.
Yeah, look, I think, just very quickly on that, I think on energy, Michael makes a fair point, and I've heard the same from the Scottish Government as well. I think there has been a lot better working, and that is to be welcomed. I really genuinely do welcome that. But we just talked earlier on about the lack of consultation on the fishing stuff, and now we seem to have lack of consultation within themselves on the winter fuel allowance. So it's not all good. There's not greater alignment across the piece. There is on energy, which is to be welcome, but this stuff is elementary, and when I was an advisor, this sort of stuff you just dine out on. You really would when you saw this in your opposition.